Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Reimagine 2021 version 10. So this is our 10th edition anniversary event. We've been doing virtual conference events for the past year now, bringing you the latest latest founders out there, latest leaders, and of course, the latest industry news. I'm Roshan Mirajkar. I'll be your host for this event, and I'm very excited to bring you a new guest. With me here today, I have David Schwartz, who's the CTO at Ripple. David, welcome to the show. And I think, of course, a lot of people know you in the industry, know you in the space, even outside the crypto world. But, tell us a little bit about how you actually first got into crypto before we do a deep dive on other things.
Thanks, Roshan. It's great to be here. I first found out about Bitcoin in mid 2011, and it came at a really good time for me. I had kind of finished the projects that I've been working on, and I was looking for something new and interesting. And when I found Bitcoin, it was just instantly I realized that there was something different, something special, something with the potential to make a big difference here. I'd been interested in cryptography. I'd been working in secure messaging and cloud storage. So the technical stuff, I'd worked in distributed systems. Cloud storage involves, the same type of distributed systems, reliability, and so on, and spreading information over multiple locations. So these were technologies that I was very familiar with. But the thing that really was made it resonate with me so much was that I was very interested in control over the way people spend money as a tool of oppression. I lived through the spread of the internet, and I saw how control over information was used as a tool of oppression. For example, like repressive governments like North Korea, Kim Jong-il at the time was believed by many in North Korea to be, perceived as an intellectual in the West and, as a serious figure. And really that, of course, is not the way that he was portrayed or thought about in the West. And people in North Korea didn't know that. And the internet and similar technologies, even people handing USB flash drives from person to person, like pierce that wall. And it's harder to repress people when they know the truth, when they know that, because they were told that people in the United States, didn't have health care and were starving in the streets. And all that's true. It's not that that's not true. It's that it's a distorted picture. When you can control the flow of information, you can use truths to tell untruths, right? We see that today with misinformation. It doesn't consist of exclusively false statements. It can paint a false picture with true statements. And the internet has, I watched the internet open that dialogue up, and actually, it's kind of sad to me that we've seen the reemergence of new gatekeepers. Who the internet has backslid on that. But what happened to me is that I thought of the control over money as a tool of oppression as well. If you can force people to use a currency that you can debase, if you can know how people are spending money and control how they spend money, that's a tool of oppression. And Bitcoin struck me as a way to sort of knock those barriers down and be a tool of liberation financially, just as the internet was a tool of liberation, in the information space. And so I just read everything about Bitcoin I could possibly find, learned everything I could about it, and I said, I want to do whatever I do next. I want it to be something in this. I had this feeling like that the space was just super exciting, and I had to work in that space. And then, I found out about the project that became the XRP Ledger, and, the rest is history.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Bitcoin gives you a lot of freedom and it's really empowering. And, just with the state of things in the world with COVID and all of the macro money printing that they're doing, how has this impacted, Ripple in general? Do you see more people doing remittances and things like that?
Yeah, when COVID first happened, we were like, oh my God, we just have no idea. Like, this could change everything in unimaginable ways. And we kind of had a bit of a pause at first. Like, let's just take a breath for a minute, and see what's going on in the world. And it seems like, at least, until a couple of weeks ago with the emergence of the Delta variant, that things were largely returning to normal. But some things will never, have been impacted in ways that won't change. One of them is the integration of technology into our daily lives as being perceived more broadly as an essential tool. And what's interesting about that is you could say that that's sort of been a negative because it's created a big backlash against tech. But I'll take people interested in what you're doing over people not caring and not seeing it as an important part of the world. Even if they vehemently hate everything you do, as long as they agree that it's important, I'll take that as a victory. Remittances are obviously critical to some of the poorest people in the world, and they're very, very badly served. One thing that you might hear from me a lot is that if you have to convince people that they have a problem, that's like strikes against you. Like people in the United States sort of on some intellectual level know that credit cards are terrible. But if you have a solution that makes them better, people are not interested because they love, let's be honest, Americans love credit cards. They work perfect. They don't see the problems. Even if you're right that something is terrible, if you have to convince people that they have a problem, that's like two strikes against you. So focus on the areas where people know they need help and they have problems. And you say, look, I know that when you make an international payment, you have a bad experience. I can make that better. Like focus on the problems people actually have. And that's kind of how I personally, and Ripple the company as well, in the in the 2012 to 2015 timeframe, really focused on payments, and particularly international payments, because people know that's broken.
Definitely. I think a lot of people know that these things aren't the future, but I think a lot of people are skeptical to change. So even when we're talking about the future of commerce, how much do you see it happening on chain versus kind of a mixture of TradeFi and DeFi?
I think there's scaling problems with keeping a chain decentralized. I don't think that we can break that. One fundamental thing, sometimes people will talk about how many transactions per second their public blockchain will do, and they'll say, oh, well, your blockchain can do 1,200, and there's this new blockchain that can do 10,000, so you're obsolete. If I could flip a switch and make every public blockchain do 10,000 transactions per second, and I just want to make the world better, I wouldn't flip it, because the problem is everybody has to receive those transactions and process them and store them. And so there's a pain point on public blockchains in that it's just expensive to do things in this decentralized way. What I'm hoping will happen is those lowest layers, whether it's the Bitcoin blockchain, whether it's Ethereum's main chain, whether it's the XRP Ledger main chain, those main chains will always be open to people. And because of that, if you're in a situation where you absolutely must have that decentralization, it will be available to you. But what I'm hoping is that most people won't need to sort of resort to that level. It'll act as the safety net that forces the businesses to be competitive. And I'll give you like a very tangible example of that. I can log into my Coinbase account. I have a Coinbase account, and I can say I want to withdraw 1 Bitcoin, and they'll ask me for the address I want to withdraw the Bitcoin to. And Coinbase has no idea who owns or controls that address right now. Like, it could be a terrorist. It could be on someone on the list of denied persons. But that's just how Bitcoin works. Like, the fact that now I'm using Coinbase. Like, I don't have to run if I only used Coinbase, I don't have to run a Bitcoin node. I don't get all of the benefits of decentralization, but I get a lot of them because Coinbase has to pass them through to me in order to be competitive. And so what I'm hoping is that as long as those lowest levels remain accessible to people, we won't actually need to use them. The fact that they're there will be sufficient. It's kind of like the legal system. If you had a super efficient legal system, it would probably hear 0 cases, because I wouldn't rip you off if I knew the legal system was going to punish me for it, right? I would have no incentive. So what I'm hoping is we can find ways to use those base layers like the legal system as the last resort that we don't need to resort to because it's so good, it's so efficient and so fair that people don't feel the need to resort to it because they pass through those benefits. But that's my hope anyway. If we have to do all of these transactions right on the decentralized chain, that's going to be a lot more painful. I think there's some fundamental scalability issues that we just don't know how to solve yet.
Definitely, and as we're even speaking today, Ethereum is supposed to go through, E 2.0, supposed to launch. Ethereum's going to start burning, things like that. But even going back and talking more about Ripple and the XRP Ledger, what do you see? Like explain how the infrastructure is better than a lot of what the banks are using nowadays, especially in COVID. People are seeing it takes them a really long time to move money in between countries.
Well, what's happening today is you see these very glitzy systems. Swift recently made some significant upgrades, and you'll see like you log into a bank user interface and it's really slick. They have a nice app and it all works really well. But if you go just a couple of layers beneath the surface, you're back in time. If you're lucky, you're in the late 70s, and you might, the way the actual money is moved is ancient. It's based on, reel-to-reel tape-based machines. What we're trying to do is reimagine the way those very lowest layers work. And in fact, like when I first found out about Bitcoin, the message that resonated me with Bitcoin is like, don't build on the existing system that enriches like the big banks, build on like the best technology and the most interesting, newest stuff. And it's funny that you now see Bitcoin maximalists basically saying, build on Bitcoin, come on, be honest, because it enriches the people, the maximalists who hold it. And it's funny that I've kind of seen that backslide of like, don't use these newer technologies. Like, we'll innovate on the second level. We'll patch all of the problems with, with the existing system, and we'll make the system work for you. But I'm still of the opinion that building the better technology is the way to go. And the funny thing is you might think that banks would like prefer a system that they can own and control. But what happens is when you think that through mentally, what happens is you sort of put yourself in the role of like a very big bank, like one of the 20 biggest banks in the world, the Deutsche Banks, the HSBCs, the Credit Suisses. Sure, they would love a system that big banks owned and control, but there's there's thousands of small banks. They are not happy with the big banks controlling the way money flows, and they would prefer a system that nobody can control to one controlled by the big banks. Because if you're a small, challenger bank, mid-range bank, the big banks are your biggest and most powerful competitors. Why would you prefer a system like you're not? If you're one of those typical, one of the thousands of typical banks in this country, you're not going to own and control the plumbing that other people use. That's just not. And look, that's not realistic. You're not big enough to target that. And you might easily prefer a system that nobody can control to a system that in fact is controlled by your biggest and most powerful competitors, the people who really would like to push pause on the world, right? The people who say that they're all about innovation, but really they're about innovation only insofar as it allows them to hold their position. Like, that's what you would do if you were at the top of the heap, right? You would try to stop time if you could, and you would obviously say that you're pro-innovation, but what that means is pro-innovation if it allows you to grab on to any technology that might jeopardize your position at the top. And so that's the dynamic that I think we can leverage for change.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, it's kind of jeopardizing, the legacy companies, their entire business model. So, like going forward, what do you think will be the competitive advantages, for things like the XRP Ledger, and even other banks, if it's not going to be custody or it's not going to be, complete control of the network, so to speak.
I think there are a lot of little things, but the biggest one, like if you want the one thing that I think is the biggest thing here, what's happening today is if you look at any means of international payment, whether it's the way you do remittances or the way big banks do the plumbing between them, what's happening is the provision of the liquidity. Like if I'm going from dollars to euros or Mexican pesos or whatever, the provision of the liquidity is sort of bundled with the payment. They're intimately tied to each other. So if I use Western Union to send money to Mexico, Western Union does everything. They take my dollars, they deliver the Mexican pesos, and they provide the liquidity somehow. So it's a bundled service. And that has a lot of disadvantages. There may be a better way for me to get money into the system than Western Union, but I can't use it. There may be a better way to deliver the Mexican pesos. Maybe I want to go to a country that Western Union doesn't, have a presence in, or maybe I want to use some other source of liquidity. The biggest thing I think is the unbundling, and where I think that's the most dramatic is in the provision of liquidity. There are people and businesses that have money in the wrong place. Apple has a huge amount of dollars in Ireland for it just wound up there. They don't need it there for any particular reason. They could provide liquidity to people who needed to deliver dollars into Ireland very cheaply, like cheaper than someone who wanted to do it as a business because they just happen to have the money sitting there. And there are people who, want to, there's probably some guy who owns a chain of restaurants or grocery stores in Mexico who lives in the United States. And he's probably paying 5% to get money from Mexico to the United States, which is, of course, ridiculous. I think the biggest thing, and I articulated in the very, very early days of Ripple, what I said is what we need is public pools of liquidity that anybody can contribute to and draw off, so that when I need to convert between one asset to another, and that could be anything, it could be a remittance, it could be a payment, it could be an investment. When I want to move from one asset to another, I want to be able to draw on everybody who needs to go in the other direction in some sense. Everybody, maybe I want to go from dollars to euros, maybe someone wants to go from dollar to Bitcoin, and someone wants to go from, Bitcoin to euros, and I can draw on all of that. We built that into the XRP Ledger in 2012. And I think Ripple has been trying to build something akin to that as an enterprise, the on-demand liquidity and similar technologies that Ripple has been working on as an enterprise solution are in that same age. So I think that's the biggest one, the unbundling of the provision of liquidity from the rest of the payment, and then that idea that I should be able to draw on the cheapest liquidity in the world for the payment that I'm making. And I should be able to contribute to it too, right? Why should I pay a spread? I should be able to provide liquidity. If I'm not in a hurry, or if I don't care where my money is, as long as I get more of it, I should be able to provide liquidity to people and let my money, bounce around different assets, different countries, and I make a spread each time. That's great.
Hey, it's exactly what, banks and other authorities above us do with the regular people's money. It's just that, they never knew about it. And I think that's what DeFi aims to solve, right? With a lot of liquidity pools, lending, and so on. What is the future of DeFi on the XRP Ledger? Like, I don't think a lot of people can visualize, how that looks right now.
Yeah, I mean, DeFi is a key focus for Ripple. I mean, our Ripple X team is looking at DeFi very, very closely. The XRP Ledger has a decentralized exchange. The decentralized exchange allows you to provide liquidity. It allows you to draw on liquidity. It allows you to move between tokens. I think those are the biggest proven use cases for DeFi. The XRP Ledger doesn't currently have a sort of generalized DeFi capability. And it's funny, a lot of people tell us, like, the XRP Ledger doesn't have a generalized DeFi capability, so I can't do so-and-so. It's like, no, we have a specific feature for that. Like, if you want a decentralized exchange, we have one. You want to issue tokens with a finite supply, like, we have token issuance. We have a lot of the most interesting DeFi features. We don't have general purpose DeFi. And that's one of the reasons that I've proposed federated sidechains, and other people have proposed hooks, which is an XRP Ledger native DeFi solution. I think both of those projects are going to go forward, and other projects may go forward as well. The trick, though, is to figure out, like, what are the interesting things in DeFi? Like, what do people really want to do, and what's the best way to let them do it? I'm a little skeptical on this point. Like, I'll just give you an example. Like, you mentioned loans. I'll tell you why I'm a little skeptical of loans. Loans can either be collateralized or not collateralized. There are very few people who need collateralized loans. Like, it's maybe as a speculative tool, like, I want to hold XRP or ETH or Bitcoin, and I also want to be able to spend money, but, like, that's a speculative tool. It's not really, there isn't really a huge demand for ways to speculate more. I mean, cryptocurrencies are pretty volatile already. Like, ways to speculate in them, ways to make them more volatile, there isn't much demand for. And loans that, like, aren't collateralized are very difficult to do in a DeFi space, because people can default on those loans. Like, there's no collateral. So, like, how does a DeFi system, like, evaluate someone's credit worthiness? Like, it just, I'm very skeptical of I don't think we know today what the big applications in DeFi are going to be. I think DEXs are proved. Decentralized exchanges and tokenization, I think, are pretty clear winners. The further away from that you get, the more skeptical I get that we know what those applications are going to be and how useful they're going to be. It's funny, I'm walking a fine line, because I'm both saying that we're really excited about it, which we are, and also that we're not fully convinced. I would make a similar argument with NFTs. Like, we're really excited about the potential for NFTs, but if you tell me, like, if you ask me, like, how are NFTs going to change the world, what are people going to be using NFTs for in a couple of years, I don't. If you asked me about the internet, I'd be excited, but I would never have told you that people would use it to watch videos of cats or to argue with each other about whether vaccines are effective. Like, you can know a technology is amazing and powerful and still be skeptical of almost every hypothesis people give you for how people will use it.
Yeah, I mean, the valuations are insane with some of these things right now. And I think the communities are fairly strong too. But yeah, it's interesting how a lot of the value, doesn't come from anything related to the traditional finance system. It's all coming from really new value abstracts. But what are some of the use cases you think that either XRP or just crypto in general, does better than the traditional system?
I think the big one is payments. I mean, I think payments is huge, and it's funny. Here's one of the things that I sort of struggle with intellectually. Payments is a massive market. I mean, the dollar amount of all payments is enormous, and the friction is enormous. Like, if you look at the cost of payments, and if you look at the efficiency of payments and the cost of companies that have to leave money pre-positioned in different places because they don't know where they're going to need it and they can't move it on a weekend, like, it's enormous. And for a long time, what I said is, let's fix payments. Like, let's do that. Let's build a better payment system. And I think we really did that. I think Ripple built RippleNet, which is a better enterprise payment system, and the XRP ledger has matured into, I genuinely believe that it is the best decentralized ledger for payments. That is a huge problem, and I would have thought that if we got to where we were, where we had solved it both as an enterprise and as a sort of open source, public, decentralized system, like, we win, right? Like, that's it, game over, right? Like, we solved a multi-trillion-dollar problem. Where's our prize? And the reality is that it's still very difficult to draw people into the space. And I think, like, one of the reasons I'm so excited about NFTs is because NFTs appeals to a completely different group of people who have a completely different problem that they're trying to solve. I still think we need to figure out what is the road to take cryptocurrency to mass adoption. The fact that it can make payments and remittances better for so many people should be enough. But the reality is, I can't tell you why. I'm baffled by this it isn't good enough. It hasn't done it. We've built the best mousetrap, and people are still surrounded by mice, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think part of the problem is two things. So one of them is usability. It's just very difficult to use most crypto solutions. And I think the other one too is there's sort of a kind of, I'd analogize as an impedance mismatch. Like the way you use crypto, like the advantage of crypto is that there isn't somebody who controls your access to crypto. That's like like if the advantage in a nutshell. Like if you look at why NFTs are popular, it's because you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Most people may not even know that they're NFT. Like they may know in theory that an NFT is on a blockchain, but they don't know what any of that means. It doesn't matter. They have this cool NFT and they can look at it and they can play with it. They get this great user experience, right? They're isolated from the technology. And if we don't know, if all of the real advantages are very tied to the details of the technology, it's much, much harder to get mass adoption. Like if I'm trying to sell you a car and I tell you this has 12 cylinders, it's super powerful, you're like, I just want to know, can I get to work or not? And it's like, you're not necessarily, if the appeal is deeply rooted in the guts of the technology, if it's rooted in security, every company will tell you they're secure. And most consumers don't think about the security of like, if I tell you this really is secure, everybody else is lying to you. Like I have to, again, I'm back to having to convince you that you have a problem so that I can solve it. So I think we have a challenge like the whole crypto industry has a challenge to face of figuring out how do we bring this like to mass adoption. And one of the reasons I'm more excited about NFTs than I probably would be otherwise, because it is still unproven and we don't know how people are going to use them, but that they provide a slick user experience and they're interesting to a completely different group of people for completely different reasons. And I do think digital rights is a big market that is still unsolved. Like every single one of us owns lots and lots of digital rights, and they're spread out everywhere, and we have no way to manage them. And like the way we manage digital rights is terrible. So I'm excited about those things that can drive to mass adoption, but I think we still don't know what that path is. Maybe it's NFTs, maybe it's DeFi, but then with DeFi, we have to solve problems people really have. Here you have to, like, for people in the United States, you have to pretend you're not in the United States, because in the United States we're overbanked. Like we have great choice. You can open a brokerage account, you can move your money around very easily. You have to put yourself in the position of someone who doesn't have those options and think like, what do they need to be able to do? And in some cases, it's just have a secure place to store their money. And like there's millions of people that don't have that. So we need to figure out if we want to grow the space, we need to figure out what that path to mass adoption is. Maybe NFTs.
Yeah, I love how honest you are as well. I mean, as far as we've come, there's a lot of work to still be done, and it's surprising too, right? Nobody thought NFTs would drive this much, new people coming in who didn't care about all of the other important aspects as much. But I think the hope is over time they start to get more educated and start to understand the importance of these different frameworks and infrastructure. But one thing I find interesting, you seem very focused on specific things. So tell me why, the XRP Ledger hasn't really integrated smart contracts as much, and how does, what's the real value of federated side chains? Is it going to drip down to retail users in the end, or is it for municipal banks and stuff like that? I'm not too sure.
Well, it's challenging to add smart contract capability, which is needed for many DeFi applications, directly to the XRP ledger without compromising its utility for payments. That's a technical it feeds back into this. Ethereum is terrible for payments because if CryptoKitties Part 4 hits when you want to make a payment, it's going to be slow and expensive. But you can't build anything like CryptoKitties on the XRP ledger. If that's what you want to do, the XRP ledger just has nothing for you today. It's just like, no, go to Ethereum or go to Binance Smart Chain or something that has that. And what we want to do is we want to sort of ease that pain. We want to give people access to fantastic payments and fantastic liquidity, but not tell them we have no answer to you if you want DeFi. What I proposed is federated sidechains, which is this idea that you have a bunch of side chains, that is chains that literally run alongside another blockchain. And each of those ledgers has their own transactions, it has their own accounts, it can have their own tokens, but tokens can easily move between side chains. Sidechains can have their own fee system, their own reserves, they have their own transaction capacity. Each sidechain will have however many transactions per second it's designed to have. It could be 1,000. And someone who wants to create a system with thousands of users and thousands of transactions per second can build a system, and they can know that they have that capacity because they purpose-built that system. That also allows them to innovate. If you want to build a blockchain that's different at the low, if you build on Ethereum, you're stuck with Ethereum's fee structure infrastructure, you're stuck with the Ethereum virtual machine's capabilities. If you built your own blockchain, you wouldn't have that limitation, but you wouldn't have any like ERC20 assets, like you wouldn't have any cool tokens on there. And so why would people want this fantastic chain if there's no assets on it? For that, like for DeFi, you need good tokens. So what I propose to crack that nut is this idea of federated sidechains with assets that can move from sidechain to sidechain. So you can put DeFi on a sidechain, and you can have one that's an Ethereum clone for people who want that. You can have one that has some different, thing. And if you want to do DeFi some other way, you can build your own chain that has it and have it running real money very, very quickly. The other thing that's been going on in the community, and Ripple has had basically zero to do with this, is this thing called hooks, which is an XRP Ledger native capability for some types of smart contracts. It's a trade-off. It doesn't provide as much capability as Ethereum does, but it could potentially coexist on the native XRP Ledger without degrading its ability to be used for payments. So it's kind of like staking a position that's intermediary sort of between the XRP Ledger and Ethereum. You do have some DeFi uses that you couldn't do on XRP today, things like loans and smart payments and so on, but you don't degrade the payment experience. And those things will all going to be developed, and we'll see how they play out in the market. Ripple's going to continue working on federated sidechains, as other people will. Wietse and Richard have been working on hooks, and they're going to continue moving forward with that. And we'll see what capabilities these provide, and which proves to provide the best capabilities to the community.
Yeah, I think it's kind of admiring how you're very focused on a specific set of use cases, or even which technologies to implement. There's a lot of projects now that they're just building and branching to any chain they really can. But from a technologist view, if it's not really about the intellectual property per se, like a lot of people are forking different blockchain, what is some of the what's the competitive advantages, and what's the real moats for these crypto projects, you think?
There may not be very many, and I think in general that's a good thing. I mean, unless you're a person who's like, all I care about is crypto as an investment vehicle, then moats are not good things. One of the things that I've said throughout this whole thing is we don't want to pressure people to use the solutions that are not the best solutions for them. Like, one of the questions we got asked in the early days of RippleNet is, why don't you just force everybody using RippleNet to use XRP? Well, we probably wouldn't have any customers if we did that. You can't tell your customers to use something that benefits you that doesn't benefit them. The strategy, I think, has to be to give people a vast array of choices and let them pick the choice that's the best. And if you are engineering ideas for a project, you don't have to be working at Ripple, you're working on ideas for the XRP Ledger, it's on you to make the XRP Ledger the best at something. Really good for some use case. And then the people who have that use case, as long as they have the ability to use it, why wouldn't they if it provides the best solution? I think what we need to do is we need to combat lock-in, and we need to combat maximalism. We need to tell people, use the solutions that are the best for whatever problem you have. Use the tokens that are the best for whatever you're doing, and don't try to lock people in. Don't try to tell people, oh, you want the Ethereum virtual machine, you have to use ETH. That was true at one time in Binance Smart Chain, among other things, sort of changed that. If we don't give people great choices, we won't have customers. And an analogy that I sometimes use is like Twitter. Twitter benefits from having strong competition, because if Twitter was the only thing to do, if Twitter was the only social network or the only thing to do on the internet, would I have home internet access? Would I have a smartphone? Would Twitter have a market? Twitter's market is people who like to use the internet for stuff. And the reason there exist people who like to use the internet for stuff is because of companies like Samsung and AT&T, and even Twitter's earlier competitors, companies like MySpace and Friendster, GeoCities, the companies that created the market that Twitter sells to. If you joined Twitter as a marketing intern and you're like, hey boss, I have this great idea how to get more people to want home internet access and smartphones, they would say you're crazy. Our target market is people who have home internet access and smartphones, right? The target market for the types of crypto products that I'm talking about doesn't really exist yet. The people who have access to multiple blockchains and have these tools that allow them to easily interoperate, and so they can pick the technologies that best solve their problems. Today you go to a browser and you can go to whatever website or whatever search engine, but best solves your problem. And that's great for everybody. So I think that's the thing that we need to get to. We need to get to an interoperable world where people can easily choose the technologies that solve whatever whatever problem they have best. And then it's on the people who are working for the projects to say, okay, we're going to be the best at something. We're going to be the best at remittances to China. We're going to be the best at low value NFTs. We're going to be the best at high dollar value, automated market making. And then the people who have that problem will go to your platform if there's nothing that stops them and you're the best. Why wouldn't they? Right? Like, you have to make people want the product. You can't. It's never going to work where you try to sort of trap people in, where you try to lock them in with some kind of moat. I say knock the moats down, because the problem right now is we don't have enough customers. The problem isn't we have all these customers and we can't get money from them, right? The problem is we don't have enough people using the technology. So we don't want to lock people in. We want to enable them.
Okay, so bring the moats down. I like
Yes.
that. I hope you start a new theme actually and get more blockchains and crypto companies working with each other, because it's the
Oh,
same.
I do have to do one thing though. So a lot of times when I say this, people think that I don't mean it. So people have told me, like, there's this old joke that, like, in the Bill of Rights, on the first, second, fourth, and fifth amendments, they forgot to put "and I really mean it" at the end. Like, if only they had done that, right? So I'm just going to put an "and I really mean it" on the end of that.
We'll make it a hashtag. That would be great if you started that hashtag. But while we're on the topic of user choice, which I really like, I think it's a good balance. How does the interest of CBDCs with all these countries impact that? Do you see a world where a lot of nation states will launch their own CBDCs, and it won't really be federated? There won't be enough checks and balances. Like, does that worry you?
A little bit, but not too much. A lot of things that you'll hear people worry about is that CBDCs will become like a tool of oppression. That the man is going to embrace the technology in some sort of a shallow way, that actually increases like oppression and control. I'm not. I'm both worried and not worried about that in slightly different ways. I'm not worried about it in the sense that I don't get worried when I see people like moving on CBDCs or something. But I am worried about it in the sense that, although to some extent I think the technology inherently pushes against that, the walls just hurt you, right? When you build an internet with walls, like China discovered this, you build an internet with walls, you try to build your own domestic internet or something, the walls just hurt you, and eventually you realize, God, this is just stupid, and you take the walls down. Like, if you look at what the internet has done, I can move information across, international boundaries super easy. And there's a lot of people who would say that that's bad, like espionage and, attacks on infrastructure. And they've just like had to accept the fact that, oh, well, like in this world, because of the tremendous benefits that we get out of the internet, people can move information in the internet. We can't search information at the border anymore. We once could do that, now we can't. Modern technology has eliminated that choke point, and regulators adapt. I mean, regulators have legitimate things that they want to prevent people do. We don't want people like attacking our electricity infrastructure or people using malware to blackmail people and demand money from them or whatever. Like, there are legitimate regulatory concerns, and regulators find ways to deal with those legitimate concerns in a freer, more open world. And I think inherently it's going to move in that direction. I think we do have to be vigilant, but we shouldn't be paranoid. I do want to make one other point about CBDCs, which is, people ask me, like, well, why would they use blockchain technology? Like, well, why would a central bank want to use a blockchain? Why wouldn't they just use a central database or conventional technologies? And the answer is, believe it or not, the way existing enterprise financial systems work, they provide their security by limiting who can access them, because they rely on a secure boundary. And so every endpoint is like an additional vulnerability. They rely on edge security to protect systems. If you want to connect to Swift, or if you want to connect to Fedwire, there's certain requirements you have to make. Like, you have to do penetration testing. You have to have a response team. And like, if you're going to open it up to everyone, the rule can't be that you have to have a response team. You have to meet cybersecurity and penetration testing. Anybody who wants to could connect to Bitcoin, Ethereum, or XRP, submit transactions, monitor the ledger for years and years and years now. These systems are not secure because their edges are secure. They're secure because they're structurally secure. And we can build systems that are structurally secure, which will enable us to eliminate the way, what happens if someone like abuses Swift? Like, regulators come down on them. If someone abuses, the Fed system, regulators come down and say, hey, you need to fix this. Like, and we have regulatory capital. We're going to put you out of business. You have funds on deposit. We have control. We have a throat to choke. Like, if your security model is that you have a throat to choke, that's very unscalable, right? You can't go around the world, policing people who use your system. Bitcoin, the beauty of blockchain systems is they don't have to do that. They don't rely on endpoint security or being able to pressure the endpoints to keep the system secure. They're secure by design in ways that no previous systems really ever were. Blockchains handle billions of dollars of value every day in a completely hostile environment. They have no central secure data store. They have no administrators or administrative functions, and their reliability exceeds the most carefully curated private systems. That's world changing. That's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think if we can build a new paradigm and make people feel comfortable, I don't even think people know, how secure that their current emails are and current banks that they're using, right? We're still getting people to use 2FA and different things like that. However, I think the regulators are certainly looking at everything. And what in general, what is kind of do you think is Ripple's responsibility when people like Gary Gensler, lays down all these new laws that he's trying to impose? Like, do you actually think, the regulations can keep up with the technology?
I hope so. I really, really hope so. The United States was a big leader in the early days of the internet. And it is not a coincidence that companies like Microsoft and Google and Amazon, Oracle, are US companies. I mean, of course, there are certainly companies in other countries, but the United States has historically been incredibly friendly to internet regulation. And that's not only produced that dramatic economic benefit, but it's produced huge intangible benefits. You can imagine an internet that originated in other parts of the world that had identity fundamentally built into every packet, where anonymity was structurally impossible. We don't have that internet. You can imagine an internet that's much more restricted, much more centralized, much more oppressive. That's not the internet we have. And that's because of the influence of people who had different values. Those weren't their values. This is happening again in the financial space. I can't stress enough how much financial freedom and finance as a tool of liberation or oppression matters to me, and I think should matter to everyone in the space. And if the United States is incredibly regulatory unfriendly for two reasons. One, we have 50 different states and DC and Puerto Rico that can have their own rules, and so sometimes you have to do things state by state, which is incredibly painful and difficult. And then the other problem we have is that we have numerous overlapping federal regulators. There's nobody who can tell you that what you're doing is okay, because you don't, we have the CFTC, we have the SEC, we have the OCC, we have FinCEN, we have all of these different regulators that regulate all of these different things, and it just makes it a very challenging regulatory environment to work in. And the biggest problem is not bad laws. If there's a bad law, that's fine. We can talk about changing it. The problem is when you don't know how a law is going to be applied to something new, and so you can't determine what you get is a legal opinion that says, well, people might say blah blah blah, but other people might say blah blah blah, and we think that you can argue blah blah blah. You get all these. And you don't know what it is you're supposed to be doing, and I'm encouraged when I see regulators and people in Washington D.C. who say we need to fix this. The United States is out of step with the rest of the world, partly for structural reasons, because the 50 states and the different there's no one entity that and there's just little leadership coming out of the United States, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity that's being lost here. Already projects started moving to Asia and Europe, years ago, and a lot of people at Ripple are like, why would we in the United, why did we leave the United States a long time ago? Why don't we leave now? The regulatory environment is just so unfriendly here. The United States is a great place to do business. I mean, the Silicon Valley is unmatched in the world. The Bay Area is incredible, and other part. I mean, I could go on for a long time about how wonderful the United States is, but ultimately, if you don't know what the regulatory requirements are, and if you don't have clarity, and you have multiple regulators that are asserting conflict. I don't know if you saw just recently on Twitter, the head, someone from the CFTC basically said the SEC has no power to regulate, pure commodities like cryptocurrencies.
I think that was this morning, right? Yeah, I saw that this morning.
And it's like, yeah, that's a position someone could take, but it's certainly not, it's certainly not a unanimous position inside, you're not going to get, yeah. So I just hope that the United States understands, U.S. regulators have a seat at the table right now. But if they leave the table, there's no guarantee they can come back. The innovation will move elsewhere. If we had faced a take it or leave it proposition with an internet built in Europe, or even Russia or China or India or anywhere, we would have taken it. We wouldn't say, no, we're not going to have an internet in the United States. We're going to say, no, we're going to build our own internet when the rest of the world has one. Those are all untenable propositions. So I just wish the industry could work more cooperatively on. It's just very, very difficult to get the industry to work cooperatively on. Part of it is if you're a Bitcoin maximalist, you want to some extent, like you have a financial incentive to see regulation be very uncertain for other things, and it's hard to get people to work together. But I hope that they can put their differences, especially people who care about the values, who care about making the world a better place. I hope that like those people can come together to some extent, but I don't know. I try to stay positive, but it's the one. There's so little I can do about it, and it's so it's a little frustrating for me, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It makes sense that you are frustrated because there isn't a clear path, and there's all different types of businesses, and you have people just spinning things up really just with their laptop. It's never been seen before in history, but although crypto is decentralized, how much do you think the regional implementation or laws matter? Like, we saw what happened in China. We're seeing an influx of, for example, a lot of miners coming into the US. So, yeah, have you seen any regional impacts anywhere?
I think the system is reasonably resilient to those types of impacts. You will see short-term shocks. Particularly, Bitcoin has a lot of mining focused in China, and these shocks might help to reduce that focus, and so that could be a good thing. I think these systems are generally resilient to that type because of their decentralization and because of their distribution. But where it is a problem is it's a problem for people who are in those particular jurisdictions that have invested in building projects. And if the overall perception is you can't build a business around cryptocurrency because the regulations will change out from under you and destroy your business, that's going to have a big negative effect. I think it's going to be primarily on those jurisdictions more than it would be, on the system as a whole. I think the internet is an interesting analogy to look at. It's very similar to in the early days of the internet, the United States tried to prevent encryption from being used, and so the United States started to lose its lead in encryption. Encryption products started to be made overseas. And wait a minute, this isn't working. So I'm hoping that what's going to happen is that regulators will realize that if they sort of push things away without really thinking about it, those things will just move somewhere else. But I mean, there are legitimate problems that regulators have to solve. I mean, money laundering, blackmail and extortion type things. There is bad stuff happening in the cryptocurrency space, and regulators have a legitimate interest in stopping that bad stuff. And there are some people in the space who are we want to make it impossible for regulators to stop people from moving stolen money. But most people understand that regulators have a legitimate interest, and they want to work constructively with them to help them to solve that. But regulators are going to have to be they're going to have to be amenable to understand that the rules are going to change. It's kind of funny. In the early days of Bitcoin, I had a lot of Bitcoin skeptics, and it's funny. Half of them would be Bitcoin is a tool of the NSA because every transaction is public and it just makes everything completely transparent. Nobody will ever be able to keep any money secret again. And the other half of them were Bitcoin is just for drug dealers and thieves because all of the transactions are completely opaque. And obviously the truth is not, those things cannot both be true, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle. And regulators, can regulate the endpoints that are in their jurisdiction, and they can solve the legitimate problems they have through those regulations. And another thing is that I am not averse to technological changes that make it easier for people who want to comply with regulations to comply with them. If you are in some jurisdiction that has some rule, and there's some change in the XRP Ledger or Bitcoin or Ethereum that can help you comply with that rule, as long as it doesn't force other people to comply with the rule who aren't in your jurisdiction, I'm fine with giving people compliance tools. I'm fine. Regulators, if you want to comply with the regulations, you should be able to. It's very difficult today. There's been an effort in Bitcoin to figure out which addresses are associated with exchanges, because there's certain jurisdictions we have something called the travel rule, which means that they have to do certain things when there's a transaction that goes to another business versus when it goes to an individual. And currently, there's no way to tell if a Bitcoin address belongs to a business or an individual. And so they're building technologies to solve that regulatory problem that they have, so they can comply with those regulations. And that's a good thing. People should be able to comply with the law, so long as they can't force people who are not subject to that law. So long as there isn't extraterritorial, the United States should not be able to force the travel rule on someone in Iran if Iran doesn't have a travel rule. They shouldn't be able to. They should be able to press on endpoints in the U.S., but they should not be able to directly press on extraterritorial jurisdictions. And one of the things that's pushing cryptocurrency is that extraterritoriality. So, for example, Saudi Arabia right now tends to use systems like SWIFT. And the United States and the EU can push on SWIFT and affect Saudi Arabia's payments directly. And they've had it with that. They're like, where you can, if you want to regulate if the United States wants to regulate Saudi Arabian payments by pushing on American companies so that they can't do business with Saudi Arabian companies, that's fair. The United States can regulate Saudi Arabia by regulating U.S. businesses' ability to interact with them, and that can put pressure on them. But they shouldn't have a veto on payments that are entirely within that, a direct veto on payments that are entirely in another region. And countries they're done with it. They're finished with having the EU and the U.S. have veto power and direct control over their financial systems. And I think that's going to drive a lot of countries to build these systems that are independent of the conventional financial system. And now I might be dating myself here, but everybody used the GPS system until the United States invaded Kuwait. And a lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, the United States could shut the GPS system off, and we're not totally happy. We don't trust them. They're our ally, sure, but we don't completely trust them. We shouldn't be relying on a system that the United States can turn off. And so the EU worked on Galileo, and Russia worked on GLONASS, and they developed these competing systems because they didn't want the United States to have an on-off switch on global navigation. And there's a reaction that the U.S. and the EU shouldn't have an on-off switch in global finance now too. So those regulatory forces are pushing both pushing in all directions. There's a lot of forces at play here.
I absolutely love that example that you just gave. It made me think of so many things about how, yeah, you're totally right. The forces at play, you can kind of manipulate, however you want, depending on the level of power and, your jurisdictions. But so basically it matters a lot. And, I think what you're saying, a more modular approach is maybe better suited for crypto, where you can add and subtract things as you wish. Another thing I was thinking about as you were talking, we're kind of in the open source war, so to speak, with crypto and a lot of the technology. I mean, it's just open source technology. What effect do you think it will have on traditional finance and even payments if the people don't need those companies? And can you give us any metrics on how large do you think these either decentralized systems or even exchanges can really get compared to TradeFi?
I think it's possible that these systems could essentially eat traditional finance. I mean, they could massively take huge chunks of them. But what's probably going to happen is that TradFi is going to adjust in ways traditional finance will get better. I'll give you an analogy because I've lived through all of these things before. One of the advantages of being old is that I can come up with analogies pretty easily. And so one interesting analogy is the way Apple sort of ate the music industry. Sony could have made the iPod, but they didn't. Apple did. Apple was a clever company. They understood the technology better. Sony was super happy selling CDs and records. That's a great business model for them. They understand physical objects. They were super happy to do it. And Apple was like, no, consumers want digital downloads. You can't keep shoving CDs down consumers' throats because that's not what they want. They don't want to have a stack of little plastic discs that they carry around everywhere they go. That's not what they want. And Apple ate the music industry. And you might say, wow, the computer industry took over music. But really, no. I mean, Apple's the music industry. Apple's part of the music industry. And they're not much different. Apple's music industry is not much different than Sony's music industry was, right? When Sony was the big guy. Sure, it's digital downloads and not CDs. But, it's if you're an artist, it doesn't look that different. Where it looks different is at the margins. So if you're the top artist in the world, it's still the same. You're still doing the same stuff with the same big companies. It's just Apple is one of the big players, right? But if you're one of the smaller players, this is different. There's an ecosystem that you have access to that you didn't have access to before. Things like YouTube and more direct access to fans. You can build a relationship with Twitter. So what I think is going to happen is the big finance is going to be different, but probably in many ways still let's be is the music industry really different because it was disrupted by Apple, a young company that was clever and they were going to make this all cool and everything? Is the music industry really all that cool? It's pretty much the same big industry it was before, but the margins are different. It's not as impenetrable at the bottom. It's more open, and if we can do that, I mean, that's a pretty big success. So if what I was talking about before about uncoupling the liquidity from the payment, that's a pretty big change. And if we can have these low-level blockchains like Bitcoin, Ethereum, or whatever, and XRP, or whatever there is in the future, and people can still have direct access to them, so they don't have to go through intermediaries, and that way an intermediary will have to compete. An intermediary will have to be a better experience than using the blockchain directly, or you won't use the intermediary. So I think we can produce a better result, but I do think in many ways, it's going to look, the broad strokes are going to look the same. It'll be better at the margins, but the broad strokes. I wish I could tell you that it's going to be super, but actually, hopefully that's more comforting to regulators, that really, like, when all is said and done, the biggest difference will be that the system will be fundamentally more open and that people will have access to the lowest layers in ways they didn't before. But by and large, the big strokes will not be all that different.
Yeah, maybe it's not a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's good. All technology advancements start at the fringe, and then you slowly have this adoption curve. And I think it's excellent that your view of being able to decouple just the payments and kind of I know you have a huge focus on that. So even looking forward in the next couple of years, like, what makes you the most optimistic for crypto right now?
I think the thing that makes me the most optimistic is is just the level of interest and excitement in the space. I think that's the biggest thing that I look at. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I can look at to get depressed. Remittances are still awful. They're still expensive. Institutions are still using systems run by the most powerful competitors. And this sort of indirect regulation, like you go to a bank and you try to open an account as a business, and the bank's like, we can't open an account for you because we're worried that regulators will push on us if we do. Like, well, how do you respond to that? Like, there's no evidence, there's no argument, there's no day in court. It's like you just, So there's a lot still to be done, but there's tremendous interest and excitement in the space. New technologies are coming out. NFTs came out of nowhere. The growth of decentralized exchanges is tremendously encouraging. The regulatory environment in most of the world is pretty. I know there's a lot of focus on the issue, bad things in China and bad things in the United States, but there's in most of Asia and Europe, there's regulatory clarity on most of the key issues, and there's people who are building there. And I think to some extent the technology is inevitable. I think once the internet reached a certain point, it was kind of, downhill. I think there's a certain inevitability that people are starting to see. The biggest thing that keeps me optimistic is that there are a lot of people inside the traditional system, even people who are doing very, very well, but who are not doing as well as they think they should do. And they're not happy about it. Challenger banks, like, I mentioned before, are a good example. Like these may be companies that have, they may be billion-dollar companies, but they think they should be much, much larger. They think they should be $50 billion companies. They're not happy, and they're going to drive change. The internet started out with military and universities, and then the next place it went was existing information service providers who are like, wow, I don't have to gather the information that I can present to people. I can just get it for free from the internet. Like, I have a service that I can offer that doesn't cost me as much. Like, that's like big information providers embrace the internet. And I think that same pattern, there was a bank robber who was asked why he robbed banks, and he said, well, that's where the money is. Right? Like, the money is in these traditional systems, and there are people inside these traditional systems who aren't happy. Governments governments like Saudi Arabia that are not happy with the U.S. and the EU having a veto over them, and small banks who are not happy with the way big banks can exert pressure over them. Banks have started actually reducing the number of correspondent relationships they have now, which is, it used to be like you would want to have as many correspondent relationships as you could have because it would give you better choice, you could be more competitive in your fee negotiations. Say, hey, if I'm not going to use you, I'm going to use someone else. But what's happening is these relationships are so expensive to maintain, and a slave worse than being a slave is being a slave with two masters or three masters, right? What they realize is, like, each one of these correspondent relationships is coming with obligations, and it's just impossible to satisfy. Like, we're seeing banks reducing their connectivity because the disadvantages of that connectivity are becoming significant. So those sort of like big forces, I think there's a combination of the time being right. I think even if not for blockchain, payments would get better. Payments suck right now. If you're, companies like Uber, Amazon, Airbnb that have to make payments around the world, large numbers of small payments to thousands and thousands of endpoints, they have hundreds of payment engineers to keep their payment systems working. If I want to start a small competitor, if I want to be the, Airbnb of Portland, and I have to hire 100 payment engineers just to be able to take money all over, like, that's a non-starter. So right place, right time. Like, people want payments to work better, and blockchain technology came right about the time there was already regulatory pressure to say, hey, if a customer's making international payment, they should know how much it's going to cost them. And they should know how much money they're going to deliver, and they should know how long it's going to take. And there was already this pressure to make payments better, coming largely from the inability of payments companies to satisfy the demands of new corporates. So right place, right time. I think the industry is moving in that direction anyway, and we have a new technology that's here, like right in there. So I'm very optimistic, or I wouldn't be here. But it also sometimes feels like we're trying to run uphill, to be honest. Like, we are trying to change things that have been the way they are for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people like yourselves and the other builders out there, you got to always focus on, the optimistic parts. The rest of the things some of them they're going to figure out, it's going to be figured out by themselves, and others it's going to require a collective effort. My last question for you is, for the entrepreneurs and the new founders out there, what are some of your key pieces of advice for them?
I remember back in the late 90s, one of the things about being through all this, the early days of search, what gave birth to Google, which is, obviously what company would not want to be Google. Everyone in the space was just super excited, and they would all tell you about how search would be the next best big thing. They would talk your ear off, and they were right. Search gave us Google. But nobody knew what the right revenue model was. Nobody knew which company would ultimately win. Google didn't seem any different than InfoSeek or AltaVista or Ask Jeeves or any of those others. That's where we are in the crypto space now. There's a tremendous amount of excitement. There's a rapid pace of technological development, but also there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about how the space will change as it matures. Like, are NFTs a flash in the pan, or are they going to be the way that crypto goes mainstream? Is DeFi going to be limited to decentralized exchanges and maybe crypto collateralized stablecoins, or is it going to open up thousands of use cases that none of us can imagine now? That's where we are. One big thing I would say is, don't think that you can predict the future. Like, always make a predict. You have to make a prediction of where you think, like, for example, Ripple made certain bets about the regulatory environment. Ripple made certain bets about the way the technology and cryptocurrency would evolve. Like, if we thought we were going to be the only company in the space, we would have not have done it, because just like Twitter can't exist if it's the only thing on the internet. So make those general predictions because you have to, but then show some humility in analyzing to see, are you going in the right place, and understand that nothing can succeed by itself. The internet, you can't have one website. You can't have an internet with one website. Like, we have to be able to solve a broad swath of problems. We really are all in this together. And the last thing I would say is focus on solving problems that people actually have. If you have to convince people that they have a problem before you can solve their problem, you're going to have and one last point, which is user experience is super important. If you look at what's been successful in the NFT space, which is like where you've seen that sort of penetration into a more of a mass market, it's because the user experience has been really good. There was a time when you had to be a mechanic to own a car, or you had to be able to put a computer together to have a computer. You couldn't. The internet wasn't graphical, and the user experience was not great, but people loved it because it could allow them to do something they could never do before. But then it was basically just people who had the patience to learn a complex and sophisticated skill because they really, really, really needed to share information. Your grandmother and grandfather wouldn't have been able to use the technology. You have to provide customers great experiences, otherwise you won't have them.
Yeah, those are all great. Thanks, David, for your great advice and your unique perspectives. And lastly, how can people reach you and learn more about Ripple if you have any links?
Well, you can certainly find Ripple at ripple.com. I should say we're always hiring. We have so many open roles; it's absurd. So if you want to do anything in the blockchain space, we're always hiring. You can find out more about the XRP Ledger at xrpl.org. It has a decentralized exchange, low cost payments. It really is fantastic for moving value. That's about it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for your time here, David. And for the rest of you who are still tuned in, we're bringing you many more interviews at Reimagine 2021 version 10. And check out our full YouTube library. We've done over 500 interviews now. And I appreciate our community who's been with us and all of our speakers. I'll let you all tune back in. Thank you.
Thanks, Roshan.